Inner Chaos by Grevin Hades. Chapter 16 Changes. Grevin sighed as he closed the door behind him. His eyes closed as he pressed his back against the cool wooden surface, the ache from his side fading for a moment as he took a slow breath. His peace was interrupted shortly thereafter when a soft laugh reached his ears. The voice attached to it sounding very familiar to him, causing a frown to cross over his features. Ugh, don't you ponies know the meaning of privacy? Luna smirked and sat herself down on the edge of his bed, much like she had the night before, her blue eyes shining with mischief. Some of us have. Some of us just choose to ignore it. I think you would feel honored to be visited by the Princess of the Night 2 evenings in a row. A rare thing indeed. He rolled his eyes as he stepped away from the door and made his way into the room, crossing his arms over his chest. Honestly, I never gave it much thought, though, now that you mention it, why is it that I'm being visited again? She grinned as he approached the bedside. Perhaps I wish to see the man who saved Canterlot, and thank him for risking everything to save us, and perhaps give him a message and reward. She winked, causing him to stop mid-step and stand still a few steps away from him. Grevin narrowed his eyes as hers locked with his, their blue hue shimmering in the evening light, her mane flowing ever so softly. And if I don't wish to have some sort of reward? After all, the whole ordeal is my fault to begin with. Luna sighed and rolled onto her side, letting her head rest back as she closed her eyes. Mr. Hades, you don't know Discord like we do. The last time he escaped, it was due to some young fillies arguing over something trivial. Escape was always a possibility when it came to him. As for the dragon, yes, it was taken from your mind, your subconscious, but you fought it off and saved a lot of lives. Frankly, I think that not only redeems you, but says something about you as well. He shook his head as he turned away, putting his back to her and letting his gaze move so it was looking outside the window. And what exactly does that say about me? That I don't like leaving messes I created He paused as he felt the tingling sensation of a magical aura wrap around his being. What's a you? Oh! He tensed as the magical aura wrapped tighter around him and forcefully pulled him back to the middle of the room, causing his feet to drag along the floor in a slow scrape. Once he stopped moving, the magical aura disappeared with a flash, and he turned his head to see that Luna had risen onto her hooves and turned to face him, her eyes narrowed in a cold stare, while her horn glowed softly, emitting a dim aura of light over her face. Her expression was stern and cold, a look that Grevin had seen before in royalty. He had dealt with it in Bastion. She was angry. I am Princess of the Night, a royal princess of Canterlot. I've come to give you a reward for your service and courage, and yet you still argue with my words? What kind of man are you? He couldn't help but smirk at the question. A very stubborn one who's used to shouldering the blame for many things. He closed his eyes, his smirk fading, and he bowed his head somewhat in respect, remembering that he was indeed a guest of the kingdom. I apologize for my rudeness. I will try to improve my attitude, Princess Luna. He raised his head once more, opening his eyes, only to find that Luna had moved uncomfortably close. Her anger faded, her piercing blue eyes now filled with a laughing gleam, and a smug smirk across her lips. Grevin pulled back, a light blush forming on his cheeks due to her proximity, as a small chuckle escaped her lips, making him feel slightly nervous. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Hades. Now, as to your reward. Her horn glowed and returned, and he watched silently while 2 wine bottles, encased in her magical aura, floated towards him from the bedside table. Please take one. He reached out and took the bottle closest to him. It was average in size, but instead of a standard cylindrical-shaped glass bottle, typical of the wine bottles he was used to, It was more curved, as if it was more like a potion bottle. The glass itself was a beautiful shade of blue, appearing almost as though it was made of some form of gemstone, with a cork stuck into the top of it. He lightly spun the bottle in his hand, hearing the contents inside slosh around a bit. "Thank you, but if I may ask, what is it?" Luna smiled as the second bottle floated over to her, and the cork lifted from it. "It's an ancient drink we know as ambrosia. It is known for providing a pleasant night's rest for those who drink it. I thought it would be the best gift for you, considering your sleeping habits as of late." This caused him to take a pause and look at her with a raised brow. "And what do you know of my sleeping habits?" She smiled warmly and sat down before him, the bottle still levitating next to her. "I believe that came out the wrong way. You must understand, as guardian of the night, it is my duty to watch over the dreams of the residents in Equestria, and help keep any dark nightmares at bay. One evening I sensed a particularly strong nightmare from you that drew my attention, so I tried to look into it in an attempt to find a way to help make it more peaceful. But I was unsuccessful. The ambrosia is simply a way I can help you find a more peaceful night's rest. Its magic should allow you to sleep with pleasant dreams and keep your nightmares at bay. I felt that a good night's sleep would do you some good after everything that occurred today." He remained silent for a moment as he looked at the bottle in his hand, then back to her, as if he was debating whether she was telling the truth or not. After a few moments, he physically relaxed and nodded a bit as he uncorked the bottle. "I think I would welcome a good night's rest. So, should I drink it all in one go, or just take a few sips?" Luna smiled as her bottle moved forward, so it was a few inches from his. "Just a few sips shall do. The bottle can last for weeks if rationed properly. May I propose a toast? To new relationships." Grevin nodded as he lightly clinked his bottle against hers. The toast did seem a bit odd to him, but it did make some sense. After all, he was still relatively new to Equestria, and was building many new friendships with various ponies now. To new relationships. He moved the bottle to his lips and tilted it back, taking a few small sips of the liquid into his mouth. He blinked as he allowed the cool liquid to run over his tongue. Its flavor was similar to a simple ale that he knew back in Bastion that was made from a variety of berries. It was smooth and seemed to flow easily down his throat, leaving a slight tingle in its wake. "I have to admit, it has a rather unique taste. Thank you for sharing this with me, Princess Luna." She smiled and shook her head, her ethereal mane sparkling and flowing seamlessly over her shoulders. "Please, when we are in a formal setting such as this, call me Luna." He nodded as he watched her take a small sip of her drink, closing her eyes, savoring the taste while her magic returned the cork to the bottle's lid, and then floated her bottle to the nearby dresser. When her eyes opened, he couldn't help but notice that their once harsh blue eyes that had pierced into him earlier were now quite visibly softer. "Well, thank you for sharing this special drink with me, Luna. I'm looking forward to the sleep it brings me." She smiled as she rose to her hooves and began to walk past him, on her way to the balcony, her ethereal tail sliding over his left arm, and part of his back as she went. "As am I." His attention was drawn to the change in her tone as she moved past him. Her voice was softer, perhaps he dare say, huskier, and laced with a tone that made him want to put his guard up. He watched her as she moved the rest of the way around him, her eyes never leaving him as she moved to the outer portion of the balcony, her wings beginning to unfurl. "Sleep well, Mr. Hades. Enjoy your dreams. Oh, and before I forget, here is the message I was to deliver to you. You are to meet with Celestia, Cadence, and myself in the throne room at 8 a.m. The bears of the elements of harmony will join us after a time. Do not be late." He nodded as he set his bottle down next to hers on the dresser. "Very well. I wish you a good evening, Princess." He watched her smirk as she turned away and flapped her wings, rising into the air and flying off into the night sky, leaving him alone. Grevin quickly shut the doors, pulling the curtains in front of the glass windows as he did so, a sigh escaping his lips. He was getting tired of the meetings. He couldn't help but wish for the simplicity of Ponyville, where all he had to worry about was making sure he came back in from the orchard before the workday began. A small scoff escaped his lips as he shed his clothing and made his way to the shower. The simplicity of Ponyville? He hadn't really expected that sort of statement to appear in his thoughts. If anything, that place was becoming more and more complicated with every passing day. As he rested his back against the cool tile of the shower, allowing the warm water to run over his form, he thought about how he could tell that some of the mares he called his friends were beginning to want something more in their brief relationship, especially Twilight, who had placed him in a very uncomfortable spot earlier that morning, but now it appeared that Applejack may be beginning to feel the same way. She did try to hide it, but from time to time he would catch her watching him in the orchard when they were working. He couldn't quite decide, however, if that was simply due to his history of him helping her sister, or if it was something more. He shook his head, trying to clear it of those thoughts, only to realize that if those two could develop feelings for him, then others may as well. He scrubbed his hair, washing away the dirt and grime he had accumulated during his fighting, and as he did, he allowed his mind to wander back to the one who was responsible for the trouble they had faced all that day. Discord. How was he going to stop a being that could easily pull any creature of pure horror, pure evil from his mind? Of course, he had to remember that he wasn't alone anymore to face these kinds of challenges. The girls had proven themselves in the past and were quite capable of handling themselves. So much so that it seemed as though they were in this world's guardians, something he had tried to be for Bastion before his arrival in Equestria. Perhaps he should do his best to step aside and allow them to go about defeating Discord without his interference. After all, they did it once, they would most likely be able to do it again. He turned off the water and picked up the nearest towel as he exited the shower. He dried his hair first as he walked back into the main room, the cloth obscuring his vision, a moment before he ran it down his shoulders, chest, and legs. He stopped just before the dresser and picked up a fresh shirt and a pair of sleeping shorts. Tossing the used towel over his left shoulder, and quickly put them on before turning to his now very inviting bed. He finished his preparation for the night as a long yawn escaped his lips. Perhaps this magical ambrosia that Princess Luna had provided him would truly help him get a good night's rest. He blew out a few of the candles, casting the room into darkness, and climbed into bed, a wave of drowsiness washing over him as he made himself comfortable. Well, here goes nothing. He closed his eyes, and within moments, he was overtaken with sleep. Perspective change. Fluttershy shifted nervously in her room, pacing back and forth before her bed, her cyan eyes downcast, and a look of worry and concentration. She paced back and forth in her room, her long pink mane moving in front of her face, her gentle cyan eyes filled with nervousness. Her thoughts raced as she moved through the room, the soft cliff clop of her hooves on the stone floor, filling the air. Her wings ruffled slightly in agitation. Her mind kept bringing her to the sleeping man in the nearby room. She knew she needed to follow Rarity's advice and tell him how she felt, but she just couldn't go up to him and tell him. No, she couldn't do that. She sighed as she sat herself down on her haunches and looked longingly out the window. She wasn't any good at being upfront about things, and ever since that attempt at being assertive, she tried to be extra careful with her actions. She didn't just want to go up to him and throw her feelings out there, catching him off guard. No, she really wanted to sit down with him, maybe over a nice dinner, or even a picnic, and give him a chance to see her as a possible love interest. The problem was, she didn't exactly know how to go about it. Hi, Grevin, would you want to go? No, I can't say it like that. Be more assertive, Fluttershy. She shook her head, her eyes becoming downcast, her pink mane covering her face once again. She reared back as she took another deep breath and planted her hooves solidly before putting on her best smile. Grevin, would you like to join me for a picnic? Just the two of us. No, that doesn't feel right either. She let out a small breath and allowed her head to droop once more. Oh, what do I do? What do I do? Normally I'd talk to Twilight or another one of my friends, but I can't really do that. Not when they feel the same way I do. Rarity already told me that I just need to go out there and tell him, but I'm too nervous. She began to pace once more from one side of the room to the other, as she tried to think of the best way to go about things. She needed advice. She needed to talk to someone who really knew how to help her. She paused mid-step as a realization hit her. She needed to talk to Cadence again. She would know exactly what to tell her, and then she could go tell Grevin how she felt. She grinned in relief and turned once again to look outside through the balcony window. Oh, I can't wait for tomorrow to come. I know he'll open up and accept me if I'm patient enough. He just needs a little push, that's all. She flapped her wings slightly as she turned and jumped onto her soft bed, and laid back on the lush pillows, enjoying the cool feeling they gave against her coat. And then we can date, and eventually. She blushed as her voice trailed off, while her mind took over. Despite trying her best to resist the naughty thoughts she was beginning to have, she couldn't help but imagine the two of them back in Ponyville at her cottage, after a long day of taking care of the sick animals, sitting down to prepare the evening meals. He would set the table first, and while she would begin cooking in the kitchen, and as she would begin to chop the vegetables, he would come up behind her and slowly run his fingertips through her mane, lightly massaging her skin as he moved down her neck, giving her a small, romantic massage. Fluttershy felt her wings begin to extend as her breathing deepened, as her arousal began to grow. She shifted in the bed and slowly ran her hooves down her torso as her mind once more took her to her fantasy. She would blush as he massaged her neck and mumble a small word, telling him that she was trying to work on dinner, but he wouldn't listen, and ran his hands down past her shoulders to her wings, lightly pressing down at their base, giving a slow massage. Her gasps and blush, she would gasp and blush as her wing would flare out, and she would try to move away, but he would gently pull her back to him, turning her to face him so she could look into his eyes. Fluttershy gasped as she opened her eyes, finding herself back in her bedroom, her wings flared out on either side, her feathers brushing against the cool fabric, sending shivers of pleasure down her spine. She panted softly in the pale moonlight that filtered through her curtains, her hooves sliding down further toward her thighs, a moist warmth beginning to emanate from her between her legs. Oh, those eyes. She could see herself just staring into those piercing red eyes for a few seconds, seeing the depths of his soul before leaning in and capturing his lips with hers, her forelegs wrapping around his shoulders as he pulled her into him, his own hands continuing to slide down her wings, sending more waves of pleasure through her, making her moan into his kiss. He would take the opportunity to dart his tongue past her lips and into her mouth, enticing her further. After a few moments, they would break the kiss, and a small trail of saliva falling from her lips would be lifted up, before she would be lifted up into his arms and stare into with her eyes into his, both showing a growing hunger. She would laugh and mildly try to fight him as he carried her to the kitchen table and lay her back across it, running his hands down her torso and flank as he looked at her, taking everything in. She would try to hide her marehood from his gaze with her hooves, only to hear a small growl escape his lips before he would forcefully pull them away, exposing her moist folds to him. He would lean down and nibble his way over her inner thighs, making her shiver in anticipation, before sliding his palm over her dripping lips, pressing ever so teasingly against her, making her bite her lip and close her eyes as a throaty moan escaped her. Fluttershy moaned as she began to slide her hoof against her now dripping sex, her back arching as her mind ran wild with the fantasy. She teased the slick folds as she thought about his hands sliding over her flesh, making her bend to his will. She could feel her sex dripping, pooling on the sheets, filling the room with her musky scent. She pressed her hoof against her clit, taking a sharp breath as she shuddered with pleasure, her lips parting as her tongue stuck out ever so slightly as she panted. She gasped once more as she stroked her clit firmly now, driving her pleasure higher and higher, moving ever closer to her climax. She bit down hard on her bottom lip, groaning as her wings stiffened even further, quaking with sensation. She pressed her hoof hard against her clit as she imagined him sliding a finger into her folds, making her arch her hips upwards, prompting him to slide another finger in, torturing her with ecstasy. She clenched her eyes shut as she rubbed herself harder, crying out as she finally reached her limit. "Oh, Grevin!" Her eyes shot open and her mouth hung slack as she came hard, her back arching up against her hoof, her breathing coming in short, sporadic, hard bursts, gasping as waves of pleasure washed through her very core, her essence pouring out of her and pulling on the bed underneath her. After the initial wave of pleasure passed, she lay gasping for air while her muscles slowly began to relax, twitching every now and again as the aftershocks washed through her very core. She shuddered once more and let out a long sigh, a smile forming on her lips as her senses returned to her. Her eyes widened as she realized just how wet her sheets were under her and how strong the smell of her scent was in the air. I didn't realize I had that in me. What came over me? She blushed bright crimson as she shifted to a dry area on the bed and decided that she was definitely going to speak to Cadence tomorrow. Surely she could help her gain the confidence she needed. She pulled the remaining dry covers over her form and yawned as she snuggled in, allowing the fatigue she had built up finally push her towards some much-needed sleep. She closed her eyes and soon drifted off into a peaceful slumber, a little smirk on her lips. Unknown to her, however, there was a small mouse hiding just behind her dresser, its yellow eyes staring at the sight of the gentle mare, now sleeping peacefully. A small grin came to its lips, a single fanged tooth protruding from it, as a simple chuckle escaped its throat before disappearing into nothingness, leaving a slight trail of fading magic in its wake. Perspective change. Grevin stood quietly on the porch of a simple wood cabin, a content smile on his face as he stared out at the glossy surface of a nearby lake. He wasn't wearing his usual cloak and armor, but instead a simple black t-shirt and a pair of pants. His face was peaceful, and his hair brushed across his face in the wind, his red eyes showing a sort of contentment in them, the mountains in the distance and the setting sun reflecting off the water's surface, making it a grand display that any person could easily appreciate and stand in awe of. The only sound reaching his ears was the gentle lapping of water on the shore, and the occasional bird calling out as it flew by. There wasn't any large, bustling city, not even a village nearby. Just him, the cabin, and the lake. another soul around for miles. His attention was so focused on the lake that he failed to notice the soft giggle or the gentle sound of feet on the wood of the porch walking up behind him. He did, however, notice when a thin pair of arms wrapped around his middle, and the feeling of a soft body pressing into his back. He couldn't help but hide his smirk when he felt the chin on his shoulder and warm breath of the woman on his neck as she snuggled into him. So, he wasn't entirely alone. Still, it was peaceful. He closed his eyes as he felt a soft kiss on his collar, and his companion's hand slowly slide down his stomach, towards his hips, a soft giggle escaping her as she tried to move her fingers under his waistband, only to be caught by his firm but gentle grip. Disc, you should be careful of wandering hands. The woman lightly nipped at his neck and pressed herself more firmly into his back, a soft groan escaping her lips. And you should come back in and teach me why I need to be careful, sugar. Griffin paused as he took in the voice behind him. It sounded very familiar. Too familiar. Like it had a certain southern drawl in it. He slightly turned his head back, glancing over his shoulder to find a pair of half-lidded purple eyes staring back at him. Attached to those eyes was a beautiful woman with long dark hair that seemed to flow and a creamy white skin that made her appear angel-like. He felt his cheeks begin to heat up as he stared at her. She seemed familiar, but he had never seen her before in his life. She smirked and moved down his left side to put herself in front of him. See something you like? He took a small step back as she hopped up onto the railing he was resting on moments before and took in her beauty further. She was a bit shorter than he was, but appeared to be somewhat muscular, yet delicate and graceful. She wore a simple gown that was a shade of lavender, matching her eyes, and was speckled with bits of shimmering cloth, that making her appear to sparkle in the light. Her eyes gleamed with a hidden intellect, and a sultry smirk played across her lips as she slid her hands into his and pulled him closer. She slid her legs around his waist, locking her ankles around his thighs, holding him very close as she moved her arms around his shoulders, her fingers tracing down his neck while she stared into his eyes. I'll ask you again. Do you see something you like? Her soft southern drawl was enough to cause him to blush. Her gentle yet teasing touch on his skin nearly made him uncomfortable. He had never been good with women, and yet here was a beautiful vixen, embracing him without hesitation. She ran the tip of her tongue over her upper lip as she moved one hand down his arm and moved his hand to her thigh, holding it there, allowing him to feel her silky, soft skin against his palm. She leaned in and kissed the nape of his neck, letting her hot breath wash over his skin, a soft giggle escaping her lips. You can leave your hand there if you want. She moved closer and pressed herself against him, moving her lips up to his ear. How do I feel so far? He couldn't help himself from slowly moving his fingers along her silky skin of her thigh, enjoying the intimate touch. His mind was a blur as he took this entire situation in. Here he was with a beautiful woman who he didn't even know the name of, wrapping her arms and legs around him, keeping him on edge with her voice, lips, breath, and touch. He shook his head slightly in an attempt to clear his thoughts. Who was this woman? How did she know him? And why was she being so forward with him? He hesitated before moving his hand back from her leg and reaching up to take her wrists, pulling back from her a bit. I'm sorry, but I can't remember you, nor how we met. She smirked as her eyes seemed to gleam while she leaned forward, letting her feet slide down his thigh and calves, pushing him back as she stood up. She moved his hands to the side as she pressed herself against him, pushing him back toward the cabin. "Aw, sugar, I'm hurt you don't remember, but it doesn't matter." She leaned in and nibbled on his earlobe while he tried to turn his head away from her. "After all the fun we had the night before, I probably made it feel like it was all a dream." This caused him to take pause, his eyes widening as he heard her words. A dream? He reached up and gently placed his hands on the woman's shoulders, pushing her back gently as his mind began to race. Was this a dream? The drink he had before, the ambrosia, was this its doing? He glanced down, looking into the sultry, lavender eyes of the woman who stared up at him, lightly chewing her bottom lip, a slight shimmer seeming to flash ever so briefly through her hair as she watched him. He blushed a bit as he saw her sizing him up. Everything about her made her look and feel so real that it began to make him question if he were dreaming before, and this was reality. Even if it were, he still felt a surge of nervousness in his stomach, similar to what he would feel every time a female would show him interest in him. Even in a possible dream, he was all thumbs when it came to women. As if to read his mind, the woman reached up and took his hands, pushing all the thought from his mind, and pulled him with her to the door of the cabin, a grin forming on her lips, deciding to take advantage of his hesitant nature. "Yeehaw, we're going to have a nice roll in the hay." After they made it past the door's threshold, she stopped, suddenly turning herself whilst wrapping his right arm around her waist, while leaning forward just enough to force him to press against her soft posterior, while she then ever so slightly ground against him, the dress she wore doing little to hide what it covered from him. "There's so many things we can try. I have this little book that I've been reading that has proven to be very, very interesting." Griffin blushed as he felt her press against him, his free hand sliding to her hip, holding her against him. I will. He gently pushed her away, taking a small step back, only to have her quickly turn and grab hold of his shirt and pull him hard into the back of the cabin, where a large bed with a rather soft-looking comforter. She seemed to have a sudden surge of strength as she half tossed him, half tripped him, causing him to land roughly on his back, bouncing slightly before raising himself up to his elbows. She smirked and moved to stand before him, while placing her hands on her waist, and then sliding them to her hips. "What's the matter? You don't think I'm going to bite you, do you? Well, I can do that, but I'm not going to hurt you." Griffin frowned and moved to sit up, shaking his head. "No, but I don't exactly feel comfortable with any of this. It makes no sense. Why would you want to do anything to do with a monster such as myself? I don't." The woman's eyes flashed in anger for a moment before she lunged forward, placing a firm hand on his chest, keeping him from moving any further. She used her free hand to roughly grip his shoulder, earning a small cringe from him as her nails dug into his skin through his shirt, while pressing him down back against the bed, a small trail of blood running down his shoulder, staining the cloth below. She grit her teeth, growling as she leaned down and stared into his eyes, while pressing her forehead against his. "Don't. Just don't. If I hear you refer to yourself as a monster or something, some form of freak once more, I will do far more than make your shoulder bleed, partner. You have a kind and noble heart, and are filled with a kind of courage that very few have." She closed her eyes as she loosened her grip, before she tilted her head back a bit and pushed her lips into his in a slow, sensual kiss, her hand sliding over his shirt, feeling his chest through the thin fabric. She smiled, breaking the kiss as she slid her fingers down and slipped them under his shirt, sliding him up over his stomach and chest. And you're proud, strong warrior. She leaned her head down and kissed his chest, enjoying the feeling of his muscles twitch under her lips' touch. She slowly made her way upwards, using her hands to slide his shirt over his head and tossing it away from them to the floor. And it would be such a shame to let this moment go to waste. She winked as her eyes met his and leaned in, capturing his lips in another heated kiss, pushing him back once more. Griffin felt himself begin to tense under her initial touch, but as her silky lips pressed against his, he felt a surge of calm wash through him, like a wave of water washing over the shore. He could feel her hands trailing down his chest toward his waist while his own began to reach up to her hips, pulling her down against him, earning a small giggle from her throat. He turned his head to the side, breaking the kiss while he tried to take a breath, giving her the opportunity to nibble on his ear, her breath hot against his skin. He could feel the blush on his cheeks become more vibrant as he felt a tightness forming in his pants. She smirked and nipped at his collar while grinding her hips down against him, her dress sliding up to her hips, exposing more of her creamy skin to the dim light in the room. She reached back and took his hands in hers, pulling them down to her thighs, letting his fingers grip the edge of her skirt. She moaned softly into his ear as she felt a firmness growing under her, making her press down harder, grinding against it, earning a small intake of breath from him. Well, it's almost like you've never done anything with a female before. Maybe I should help you with that. She kissed down his neck and began to slide down his form, nibbling at him from time to time, enjoying the feeling of him twitching under her. She grinned, her eyes looking up at his, while she snaked a hand down and began to rub it over the bulge growing in his pants. Well, what do we have here? Griffin groaned slightly as he felt her touch him through the cloth of his pants, his member growing with each passing second. He could only watch with awe as she moved down his body with a kind of well-practiced grace, his eyes widening as her fingers unsnapped his pants and slid his zipper down with ease, before snaking her hand in and grasping him fully. She pulled the throbbing member out, exposing it to the cool air, holding it in her hand, smirking as she ran the edge of her thumb slightly over the sensitive head, earning a sharp intake of breath from the man under her. He blushed as he felt her slowly begin to stroke him, sending a shiver through him. Oh, what are you doing? She simply looked up at him, her lavender eyes shining with mischief, winking before she slid down and placed several light kisses over the head, before pulling back and raising up to sit on her knees, moving so she was once again straddling his waist. I'm going to make you feel good, and she moved her hands to the base of her dress, lifting it up, revealing her creamy thighs, then a pair of dark blue panties that hugged her hips, a small spot of moisture forming where her nether lips rested against the fabric. The dress moved up further upwards, showing her flat, smooth stomach, and then finally her breasts, which were nearly bursting from the matching dark blue bra that barely held them back. Griffin watched silently as the scent of her musk flowed to his nostrils, the sight of her sleek, sexy body resting over him, nearly overwhelming his senses. She nibbled her bottom lip as she slid a hand down her stomach, letting it rest just over her panties, her fingertips playing with the hem. And hopefully, you'll make me feel just as good later. Griffin could feel his member ache with each pulse, causing it to throb. The shaft so hard it seemed as though it was trying to reach up to pierce her moist panties. He slid his hands up to her legs, to her hips once more, almost as if they were moving on their own, and pulled her forward, making her fall onto him. Once more, a laugh escaping her lips before they were captured by once again, but only for a moment. She quickly pulled back and moved again down his form, her fingertips gliding over his stomach. But more noticeably to him was the way her legs, her pelvis, her stomach and chest slid so easily over his hard member, teasing him with sensations of her flesh, letting herself stop when it came to her lips. She winked at him as she grasped him once more in her hands, the heat of his flesh enticing her as she slowly stroked it, watching him, enjoying him squirming under her ministrations. She lowered her head once again and planted soft kisses on the head of the cock, teasing him with every slight flick of her tongue. She turned her head and cradled it in her hand, while she slid another hand to his hips and began to pull his pants down, while she ran her lips down the side of the shaft, her tongue lapping at the sensitive underside, causing a groan to escape from his throat. She paused only long enough to pull his pants and boxers from him, letting the cloth join his shirt at the base of the bed, and then returned to her task of making the man beneath her squirm with pleasure. She gently grasped the large shaft and slowly ran her tongue up from the base to the tip, earning another groan from him. She playfully ran the tip of her tongue along the sensitive bottom of the cock head, a wicked gleam in her eyes. "Enjoying yourself?" Griffin blushed, averting his eyes, his words seeming to catch in his throat. He mumbled something but she wasn't satisfied with that. She moved her lips down the other side of the pulsing member, darting her tongue over the sensitive flesh, causing him to twitch at even the slightest touch. She closed her eyes and pulled back a moment, slowly, until the tip of his member rested on her tongue, letting it sit there for a moment before moving forward in a swift motion, taking him into her mouth, her lips sealing themselves around the mouth, around the shaft, her cheeks caving in from the suction, her tongue darting all around, the shaft her tongue darting around the shaft, feeling every distinct vein, every pulse of his heartbeat through it. He could only gasp as he felt her begin to work his member with ease, bringing wave after wave of pleasure to him. He raised his head and looked down at her as she bobbed her head up and down, her eyes open, now staring up at him, gleaming with lust and want. She slid a hand up his thigh, allowing her fingertips to brush the base of his cock, before moving down to cup his sack, gently massaging them, making him rest his head back once more with a moan, the pleasure beginning to build towards an inevitable climax. She smirked inwardly as she felt him twitch under her skilled tongue, her hunger growing with each suck, every twitch from her lips. She slowly pulled back, her lips separating from him with an audible pop, a small trail of saliva trailing from the tip of the head to her smiling lips. She slowly stroked him, keeping him on edge as she lightly kissed his thigh. "Do you want to come? Do you want to fill up my dirty little mouth?" He blushed, looking away, but gave a small nod, but she laughed and lightly squeezed the member just hard enough to send a small twinge of pain up his body, making him look down, locking eyes with her. She shook her head and lightly kissed the head, letting her tongue dart over the crown. "No, you need to tell me. What do you want?" Griffin felt as though he were going to burst. A bead of sweat rolled down his cheek as his eyes locked on hers. She winked as she slowly stroked him, somehow keeping him on edge with ease. Well? He felt his cheeks warm as he opened his mouth, the word catching in his throat. He swallowed the lump in his throat and spoke, his words coming out as a whisper. I want to come. She smirked and leaned in, letting her lips brush over his shaft, making his hips jerk and his muscles twitch. But I want to know what you want me to do about it. Where do you want to come? Grevin grit his teeth, a small growl escaping his throat, the pressure driving him mad. I want you to suck my cock. Make me come in your mouth. I can't take much more of this. She grinned and slowly licked the shaft from the base to the tip, earning another groan from the prone man. What's the magic word? He growled once again, tilting his head back, his member twitching under her touch, the head leaking pre-cum and swollen to its limit. Please. She flashed a wicked grin and surged forward, taking his member in her lips once more, darting her tongue over the crown as she began to suck, taking just a moment before wrapping her fingers around the base of the shaft, and began stroking him as she began to bob her head, causing him to thrust his hips up to meet her. She closed her eyes and began to hum, sending waves of pleasure through his member to his very core. She smirked as she slid her hand down to caress his balls, deciding to finish things there and then. She suddenly leaned forward and took the entire shaft between her lips, letting her tongue dart around the underside of the pulsing member, her eyes going wide as she felt him push down into her throat. Grevin groaned as she deep-throated him, the feeling of her throat and tongue massaging his member being too much for him. I'm going to... He clenched his eyes shut as his sentence was cut off, a grunt escaping him as he released his seed, pulse after pulse filling her mouth with his essence. She moaned as she pulled back, feeling his hot cum shoot into her mouth, filling her with each pulse of his cock, a small smile fluttering out as she held him there between her lips. She watched him as he came down from his high, her eyes watching him, his chest as it rose and fell with every breath. She pulled back, letting his member fall as she crawled up his prone form, allowing her face to hover over his for a few silent moments while he gathered his senses. She slowly swallowed the contents of her mouth, a soft moan escaping her throat, drawing his eyes back to hers. She winked at him as she slid her arms around him. You haven't done that in quite some time, have you? Or perhaps that was the first. He slowly shook his head, trying to gather his wits and see through the pleasurable haze that she had put him in. Pausing after a moment, a simple thought entering his mind. Wait, didn't you say that we did something before? She smiled and ignored his question as she nuzzled into his collar, pulling him against her soft form. You taste good, and he gave me plenty. She planted a small few kisses on his neck, giggling in his ear. But you have to go for a little while. He blinked, turning his head in confusion forming in his eyes. What? I don't understand. She smiled and placed a hand on his cheek, her lavender eyes staring into his, a soft smile on her lips. You have to go now, but I know you'll see me again at some point. He closed his eyes and shook his head in confusion as a cool, wet feeling began to make its way up from his waist, making him uncomfortable. What the? He sat up, opening his eyes, only to pause, taking note that he was no longer in the isolated cabin, but instead in his guest quarters in Canterlot Castle. He quickly looked around for the woman he was with, only to find empty bedsheets next to him. He frowned as he looked down at his waist, noting the mess created by his dream, a sigh escaping his lips. Ugh, great. A fucking wet dream. He did his best to slide out from the sheets and remove the now sticky shorts, while making his way to the bath. He started to shower and paused, taking note of the sound of chirping birds coming from outside, as well as the small rays of sunlight coming through the balcony window. It was morning. A small smile began to form on his lips. Despite his discomfort with waking up in a sticky mess of his own making, he couldn't help but feel thankful for the rest he had received. He would rather have dreams like that than the nightmares he had been having. He glanced over at the bottle of ambrosia that rested on the counter, before turning to get himself cleaned up. Perhaps he would try that drink again at some point. Perspective change. The next morning. Twilight quickly gathered her things and packed her saddlebags as she prepared for the day's events. It was their last day in Canterlot, and they had been summoned at a meeting in the throne room first thing that morning, followed by a quick trip to the train station to take the train back to Ponyville. She levitated the last of her belongings into her saddlebags and closed the clasp, as her thoughts drifted back to the conversation she and Applejack had with Cadence the night before, a simple smile coming to her lips. That night, they watched Greven slide away from speaking with her brother and into his room for the night, Fluttershy soon retiring to her room as well, after speaking with Rarity. They then turned to Cadence with wide eyes and bright smiles, a simple question lingering in their minds. For her part, Cadence simply smirked at the mares and gave a small giggle, waiting for them to ask the question that she knew was coming. She watched her sister-in-law with mischievous eyes, waiting as Twilight shifted somewhat nervously a moment, while Applejack gave her a small nudge with her hoof. Go on, Twilight cleared her throat a bit as she gathered her thoughts, her nervousness showing clearly in her eyes as she looked up at her former full sitter. Right, well, Applejack, Fluttershy, and I were wondering if you had any advice about how we could get a certain, someone to open up a little bit and perhaps see us as more than just a friend? Cadence's eyebrows raised a bit before she smiled and nodded. Twilight, are you telling me that you... She paused and glanced at Applejack before continuing. And some of your friends have developed some feelings for a certain stallion? She shifted on her hooves slightly and looked away sheepishly. Well, not exactly. Applejack sighed and stepped forward. Stop stalling, Twilight. She cleared her throat and addressed Cadence. Princess, we've begun to take a liking to all tall, dark, and stubborn in that guest room over there. Do you know what we should do to get him to see us in a different light? Cadence sat down and said nothing as she gathered her thoughts. After a few moments, she spoke again. Well, I have sensed that he is deeply lonely in his heart, so perhaps he may not entirely realize it. Perhaps probably he feels deep inside that he is alone here, being the only one of his kind in all of Equestria. I do think that something happened to him, something that caused him to be very wary of the opposite sex. Applejack frowned but nodded, while Twilight looked down. Something did happen. He told us that back in his world he had grown close to a woman he had fallen pretty hard to. She betrayed him and tried to hand him over to an enemy who wanted to kill him. He never spoke of any other loves. Cadence frowned, her eyes narrowing. That's terrible. No wonder he puts up such barriers. His only experience with love was marred, and now he feels as though he shouldn't even attempt it. For anyone to do that to one that loves them. Terrible. She sighed and looked down a moment and thought before a soft smile graced her features. All right, I'll give you a few ideas, but it will have to wait till tomorrow, after the meeting with the princesses. Twilight blinked a moment in confusion washing over her features. Cadence, why do we have to wait? Wouldn't you be able to tell us something now? She giggled a bit and nodded. Well, I can tell you a little bit, but most of it will have to wait till tomorrow, because Fluttershy is already in her room. It'd hardly be fair to give you all the information and leave her in the dark. Now, enough of this. Let's get back to enjoying the party. Tell me, Twilight, will Ponyville be ready for the annual Nightmare Night celebration? Twilight smiled, her eyes shining. Absolutely. In fact, we've actually planned for a more adult celebration later in the evening, once the foals have gone to sleep, to honor Princess Luna. There will be great music, food, drinks, and plenty of fun. Wonderful. Do you know what you'll be dressed as this year? Both Applejack and Twilight blinked a moment, their eyes glancing to the side as they sat and thought. Both sighed and shook their heads a moment before Applejack's eyes widened and a smile broke out across her lips. Wait a sec. What if we ask Revan about some creatures from his world? I reckon he'll know about some things we could dress up as. Twilight grinned, her eyes shining. That's a great idea, Applejack. I bet he can tell us all sorts of things on the train ride back to Ponyville. Present time. Twilight smiled, thinking about the various creatures that she was going to learn about in a few hours, but before she could focus her attention entirely on that, she needed to get Fluttershy up and meet the rest of the main six in the throne room to hear what had been decided about Greven's presence in Equestria. She quickly trotted over to the timid mare's room and knocked on the door, a light smile coming to her lips when she heard the predictable sound of a panicked shriek faintly echo through the door. Fluttershy, it's me, Twilight. It's time to head over to the meeting. Are you ready? She heard the sound of rustling cloth and hurried hoof steps behind the door, but no response from her friend. Fluttershy? She knocked on the door once more again, only to hear nothing this time. She narrowed her eyes and flared her horn to life, pushing open the door to see her friend frantically rushing about the room, trying to fill her saddlebags. She began to step into the room, only to be forced back, bringing a hoof to her nose, as a particular scent wafted to her nostrils, forcing a blush to her cheeks. Gah! Fluttershy, what is all this? Why aren't you ready yet? The shy mare quickly closed the clasp of her saddlebags and ran forward to her friend, a worried look in her eyes and a bright blush on her cheeks. Twilight, it isn't what it looks like. I slipped in late and, Twilight shook her head, stepping back, a small frown on her lips. Fluttershy, is that scent what I think it is? She ducked behind her pink mane, looking down, a small squeak escaping her. It's not what it seems. Things got a bit out of hoof. Twilight rolled her eyes and glanced away. Look, Fluttershy, it's okay. You had a bit of fun last night after you went to sleep. That's fine. But we need to get going now, okay? Princess Cadence wants us to meet her after the meeting. The Scion Pegasus nodded and quietly trotted out to join her friend. Yes, sorry. Do you know why she wanted to meet us? Twilight fell into step with her friend, making their way towards the throne room. Yes, she wanted to help us find a way to get Greven to open up. A way to get him to see that we can be more than just friends. That he can find love in this life. Fluttershy smiled as she lightly ruffled her wings slightly. Oh, well, that would be wonderful. He's certainly deserving of having that in his life. Twilight simply smirked as they continued on their way towards the throne room. Scene change. Main throne room, Canterlot Palace. Grevin silently entered the large entryway. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving an air of ominous silence in its wake. He wore no armor and no weapons. The guards made certain to disarm him fully before allowing him to enter, leaving him in his everyday boots, trousers, shirt, and cape. His footfalls sounded heavily on the ornate floor as he approached the risen thrones at the far side of the room, where Princess Celestia, Luna, and Cadence all sat, waiting with a serious, stoic look in their eyes. He didn't have his hood up, a sign of respect for the ponies waiting for him. His red eyes slowly scanned the room, taking note that there were no other souls in the room, except for the princesses and himself. Of course he knew that it wasn't all as it seemed. Only the most foolish of rulers would leave themselves completely without guards. There most likely were court mages waiting in the wings, watching with some sort of spell ready to send in guards if needed, though he knew it wouldn't be needed. He kept his hands at his sides as he closed in on the base of the staircase that led to the thrones, where they sat watching him, no emotion on their faces. He couldn't help but remember how well royalty could control their emotions when in court, and from the look of things, even the youngest member, Cadence, was as skilled as her aunts at this. He stood a moment at the base of the stairs and looked up at the regal ponies before sliding into a kneeling position, his hands remaining at his sides, his head bowed. Princesses, I understand you wish to speak with me. Celestia watched him a moment before she rose to her hooves and cleared her throat. Yes, Grevin, we have much to speak about. Luna rose to her hooves and stood next to her sister, her blue eyes staring at him as if looking into his very soul. The release of Discord, the disobedience of a royal order. Cadence now rose and moved next to her aunts. And the incident with the dragon in the marketplace. Grevin sighed and said nothing. He simply nodded his head and waited for them to continue. He knew that the way things went yesterday, his disagreement with Celestia, his release of Discord, and then the loss of life in the marketplace, he was sure he would receive some form of punishment. Celestia kept her face blank, her voice calm as she spoke, her eyes staring at him. Due to unforeseen circumstances, a great danger was once again released upon Equestria. Discord, a being of pure chaos has been set free, and for the moment seems to be leaving well enough alone. But in time, he will return and disrupt the peace we have strived to keep here. Luna closed her eyes, looking down. A direct result of his release was the sudden appearance of a dragon and several aggressive lizardmen in the downtown area of Canterlot. Several thousand bits of damage resulted in the attack. Cadence lightly cleared her throat as she continued. Another result of this dragon attack was the loss of life of a mother and citizen of Canterlot. Celestia kept a hard gaze on Grevin's form as she slowly stepped forward to the edge of the stairs, her mane flowing out behind her. A direct cause of this was your presence in the royal stone garden. The chaotic nature of your being, your soul, provided enough chaos for him to escape. On top of that, when the bearers of the elements of harmony and I were going to find him, you disobeyed a royal order in order to fight him. Grevin said nothing and closed his eyes, a frown coming to his lips. This was it. This was where he was going to get a royal talking down to, and thrown into a dungeon for the damage he was responsible for. He was prepared for this, though. He knew that despite the kind words of his friends and Luna, he still had to answer for his actions. Celestia continued, as she slowly began to step down the stairs, Cadence and Luna following behind her. You rushed in, sword drawn, and attacked the dragon and his soldiers, saving the life of the captain of the royal guard, Princess Cadence's husband, shining armor, as well as several innocent foals who had been trapped by the beast. The three princesses stopped just in front of him, each one still staring at him with a level gaze. You received heavy injury fighting the beast, but as you stated, you were able to take the beating and continue on. You distracted the creature long enough for Captain Armor to dispatch the beast, saving many more from harm. Greven's eyes opened quickly at the slight change in her tone, but dared not move or interrupt her. He listened quietly as he heard Luna take a slow breath. On top of that, you were willing to take full responsibility for all of this, even though many elements were out of your control. You were selfless, willing to allow yourself to come to harm while trying to help those in need, including those you did not know. A noble trait to have, and a rare one at that. Celestia slowly began to walk around Greven, leaving the other two alicorns where they stood before him. It's clear there needs to be some form of action taken. She stopped once she had completed a circle around it. So, after careful consideration and long discussions with my fellow princesses, a decision has been reached. He nodded once again, closing his eyes, preparing for his fate. Perhaps a simple stay in a dungeon, perhaps some hard labor, perhaps even death, either private or public. He steadied his breathing and steeled his heart, waiting for what came next. It has been decided that you had no malice behind what occurred that day. The release of Discord, the dragon attack, the loss of life, all of these were a result of circumstances beyond your control. The fact that you rushed to aid those in need and did all you could to shoulder the responsibility has shown that you are shown us your true character. It is because of these things that we have decided to offer you a unique position. His breathing paused, his eyes shooting forward in surprise. He kept himself from raising his head, but his shock and surprise were apparent. A unique position? Celestia began to smirk, her lips curling up a bit. Indeed. You see, back when Luna and I were just foals, our father, King Solaris, spoke of a special kind of knight. These ponies were given the same rights as several lower members of the royal family, and were referred to as spectral knights. He slowly raised his head to look at the three, who now stood before him, a questioning look in his eyes. A spectral knight? Luna nodded. Indeed. You must understand that these knights were not typical. They operated outside the regular military. They were responsible for many things that regular members of the military could not take care of. Some were responsible for providing protection from skilled assassins, excursion into foreign territory, even secret military actions, all of which were meant to help keep the peace in Equestria. He frowned, his eyes narrowing. You wish me to essentially become a weapon for your kingdom? I refuse to be something like that. Cadence frowned and shook her head. No, of course not. Greven, please understand. The last time knights such as these existed in Equestria, Discord brought chaos all over Equestria. A battle was coming, and the peace we know was but a dream. Your duties would be very different from those of knights of the past. He locked eyes with Celestia before slowly relaxing. All right then. What would my duties consist of? She simply smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. Nothing too severe. Simply do what you do best. Keep your friends and innocent ponies safe from threats. Report strange incidents to Luna, Cadence, or myself, and carry out any missions we may need you to complete. He smiled a bit, the tone in his skepticism rising. It seems simple enough. Is there some form of catch? Luna nodded, her eyes locking on to his. You will have to take your orders directly from us and the elements of harmony. There is one other thing. What is it? Celestia spoke. Her eyes closed as Luna and Cadence stepped back. Whenever our father would speak of the ancient knights, he often spoke of the powerful magic they wielded. It would aid the knights in battle and help keep them on the right path, the path of goodness and might. If I had to compare them to anything, I would have to say they are similar to the elements of harmony. This caught his attention. They were like the elements. She nodded solemnly. Yes, but they were known as the elements of valor. They were an amazing force to be dealt with, but sadly, the wielders eventually became corrupted by the power they were held, forcing Father to strip them of it. After that, there was peace for several thousand years. Father met our mother, and we were born, grew, and took our rightful role as princesses of Equestria. She paused and closed her eyes as the memories flooded her mind. Then Discord appeared once again, ready to fight for the right to rule over Equestria. Father tried to fend him off, but Discord escaped and evaded capture for many years. Once more, our father decided that the best way to defeat chaos was to bring harmony to the land. So he used all of his power to convert the elements of valor into the elements of harmony, and bestowed them upon Luna and I. Luna looked down, a sadness filling her eyes. We were able to defeat Discord for the first of many times, but sadly, Father, King Solaris, died with the creation of the elements. In his last moments, he held us close in his wings and told us of a great secret. He stated that he had visions that showed signs of the return of the spectral knights in Equestria. He said that they would be needed to defend alongside the elements of harmony against all manners of foes. He also said that he did not destroy all of the elements of valor. He stated that one remained, one that had not become corrupted like the others, one that would aid the elements of harmony if ever needed. Griffin blinked a moment, his eyes looking at the three mares that stood before him. Wait a moment. You're telling me that there's another element? You're not going to give it to me, are you? His concern was evident in his eyes. That kind of power in his hands was of one who had such a dark past as him would be far too tempting to have. Celestia shook her head, her mane flowing ever so gently over her neck. No, you see, when Father told us this, he was disoriented, dying. We did not know what it is or what isn't true. We don't even know where this element would be located, what it represented. Besides, elements are earned, not given. He frowned and pursed his lips together for a few seconds, his eyes showing a small bit of relief, before taking a slow breath to continue the conversation. So, why are you telling me this, then? We would like you to learn about the Spectral Knights and the elements of valor. Perhaps you can use the help of Twilight to learn more about them and what they used to do. There hasn't been one in Equestria for many years, and little is known, but there are texts about them. So now, we must ask you, are you willing to shoulder the responsibility of being the first Spectral Knight in several thousand years? Griffin looked away, allowing silence, his gaze looking out the window while he weighed his options. If he accepted this, he would be in the service of the land, given a purpose. However, he would still remain a risk, possibly a worse risk than before, because now he would be in a unique position. He didn't have anything to return to. Bastion was lost to him, and it was his fault that Discord had been released, and it was his responsibility to make things right, no matter the cost. He slowly brought his gaze back to the three alicorns before him and slowly nodded. I'll accept the responsibility. Celestia smiled softly as she and the others moved to surround him. Very well. In that case, let us begin. The three closed their eyes, and moments later, their horns flared to life with the strong glow of a powerful magic. Slowly, they leaned their heads forward and placed a horn on his shoulders and head, allowing the aura to envelop him in its soft glow. Luna smiled a bit as the aura from her horn began to glow and began to increase in intensity. Greven, by accepting this position, you pledge your soul, your blood, your knowledge, and your abilities to aid the royal family, the elements of harmony, and the ponies of Equestria. Do you understand what will and may be asked of you? He simply nodded. I do. As the words left his lips, he felt a strong surge of magic enter his body from all sides, taking his breath away, as flashes of light seemed to burst through his head, disorienting him. A sharp tingling sensation flooded over his shoulders, then down his arms and chest to his legs, but soon was replaced by the warmth that seemed to help him relax. Slowly, the sensations began to fade. His thoughts began to clear, and he found that the princesses had stepped away from him, the glow from their horns fading. The three wore warm, proud smiles on their lips as Luna stepped forward, extending a hoof to him. Rise, said Hades, and prepare yourself for your first mission as the first of the spectral knights in over 1,000 years. Slowly Greven rose to his feet, a strange feeling remaining in him, almost like there was a small sense of peace buried deep within his soul that he hadn't had before. He popped his neck as he rose to his full height, his hands sliding behind his back as he stood at attention, his red eyes showing no emotion as he looked back at the three before him. I am prepared to do what is needed of me. Luna smirked as she stepped back, her eyes taking on a mischievous look that always made him feel a little bit nervous, while Celestia cleared her throat. Your first assignment is to watch over Ponyville and the elements of harmony. If anything strange occurs, inform Twilight or one of us, and we'll take care of things from there. While you do this, you need to go about your research with Twilight and try to discover more information about the Spectral Knights. Luna smirked as she stepped back, her eyes taking... He nodded while keeping his gaze locked, but his thoughts were easy enough to know. This was a babysitting assignment. He would be doing the same thing he would be normally doing anyways. Are there any other instructions or assignments? Celestia smirked, a gleam entering her eyes that made his thoughts stop cold. Yes, there is. It's still the matter of how we should handle your behavior before you left to help the ponies in the market. You assaulted the royal guard, disobeyed a direct order from me. While your actions ultimately came out for the best, you still need to answer for what you did. He sighed but said nothing as he shifted on his feet, his hands still behind his back. He nodded slowly as he moved his gaze so it locked with hers. You're right. I was out of line, and my actions resulted in the assault of a god and extreme disrespect towards you. I won't say what I did was wrong, however, and would only change one aspect of the entire ordeal. She perked an eyebrow as she slowly began to walk around him, keeping him in the corner of her eye. Oh, and what would that be? He paused a moment as she moved around him, his gaze unwavering as he stared straight ahead. I would move faster, perhaps save the life of that mare before it was too late. Celestia stopped behind him and glanced back at her sister and niece, a smile coming to her lips. You are a kind and noble soul, Greven. You don't try to make anything for yourself. You are always looking for ways to help others, regardless of what happens to you. which is why we are giving you a particular assignment. He frowned, the tone in her voice sounding almost like she was amused, causing him to feel uneasy. He glanced over his shoulder, his red eyes narrowing, finding her looking back at him with a soft smile and gentle eyes. And what is this particular assignment going to be, Princess? You will be attending the Grand Galloping Gala. He blinked and began to turn to face her. I'm to attend a banquet and a dance? She smiled slowly and moved past him on his right, while his attention was drawn by Luna brushing his arm against her as she moved past his right, bringing her into his vision, while Celestia continued to speak. Yes, you are, and while you're there, you are to help keep a lookout for any possible danger. Be polite to guests, making them feel welcome, and finally, you are to be Luna's personal guard and escort her for the night. His jaw dropped slightly as he locked eyes with Luna, who now had a bright smile on her lips and a gleam in her eyes. She slowly moved forward until her face was inches from his, her deep blue eyes staring at him. He shook his head, pulling back slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. You, want me to be Princess Luna's escort for that evening? On the, more qualified ponies for this sort of thing? I don't know any of the etiquette for such an event. Luna's smile never faded as she shook her head. Nay, Greven, it is part of your duty as a spectral knight, not to mention it's an honor to get to escort the princess of the night. She narrowed her eyes, sending a chill down his spine. Are you telling me you wouldn't want to have that honor bestowed upon you? He blinked and quickly shook his head. No, not at all. I just, Luna reached up and placed a hoof to his lips, silencing him. Her eyes were once again bright, and a smile adorned her lips. You will be given time to learn customs, and Rarity will design a proper suit for you to wear, so don't worry, all right? She grinned as she slowly nodded and stepped back once more. Excellent. And it's decided. Sister, let us bring in the bearers of the elements and inform them of the good news. Celestia smiled and looked to Cadence, who had moved to the large doorway. Very well, let them enter. Cadence nodded as her horn began to glow, placing a magical aura around the sealed doors, opening them and revealing the main six standing there in idle chat, their attention drawn to the princess above. Every pony, could you please come into the throne room? Princess Celestia has an announcement to make. The group moved into the room with bright eyes and small smiles on their faces. Within moments, they all stood before the princesses, and Greven. Celestia smiled and lowered her head slightly in greeting to her subjects. Good evening, my little ponies. I trust you all had a good night's sleep. Pinkie Pie leapt into the air with a laugh. You bet we did! That party was awesome, and the beds were so soft it was like sleeping on a cloud. Rainbow Dash laughed and shook her head. Not quite, but it was still pretty awesome. Twilight rolled her eyes at her friend's antics before glancing at Greven, noting his lack of armor and weapons. She glanced over his shoulders that were crossed over his chest, then back up to his eyes before turning to her mentor. Princess, may I ask why you asked us all to meet here? Celestia nodded and glanced at Greven, her flowing mane shivering slightly in the sunlight. The answer is quite simple, Twilight. Something wonderful has happened concerning our new friend. Celestia simply Applejack tilted her head to the side, her green eyes and a small frown showing her confusion. Princess, I mean no disrespect, but hasn't he been through enough for 1 week? Celestia simply smiled as Luna stepped forward. Please understand that Greven has been given a great honor. He has accepted the title of Spectral Knight. Pinkie cheered and hopped around, Woohoo! That's awesome! Totally cool! She paused after a few seconds and blinked, looking over at Twilight. What's a spectral knight? The group turned to look at Grevin with wide eyes. He said nothing and waited for Luna to continue. Luna managed to suppress her laughter, but grinned as she turned to face the quiet man. A spectral knight is something that hasn't existed in Equestria for 1,000 years. They act as protectors, helping those in need and aiding either the royal family or the bearers of the elements of harmony when called upon. Rarity shook her head, her mane swishing slightly in front of her eyes. Pardon me, but it almost sounds as if he has to do whatever we ask. Is that accurate? Accurate? I'm not certain I like the sound of that. Cadence shook her head, her eyes softening. No, of course not. He hasn't given up his free will. He simply has accepted an offer that we gave him. Spectral Knights operate outside the military and royal guard. He receives missions from Celestia, Luna, and I, and can report to all 6 if needed. His first mission is to keep watch over Ponyville and inform us if there happens to be any signs of discord in the area. By no means is he forced to do whatever we say without hesitation. Twilight raised a hoof to her jaw as she looked down and thought. All of this was quite surprising to her, to be honest. She had never heard about the Spectral Knights from Celestia, and had only heard about them in tales and myths and ancient equestrian texts that she had read years before. She looked at Grevin, taking note of his calm demeanor as the conversation went on. He wasn't as bright and cheery as Pinkie Pie, by any means, but he didn't seem to have the same dark cloud looming over him like he did when he first came to Ponyville. A small smile came to her lips as she allowed herself to tear her gaze away from him and back to her mentor. Twilight, when you return to Ponyville, you and Grevin can research the history, traditions, and all the other aspects of the Spectral Knights from those years ago. Hopefully, together, the history of the Spectral Knights can be recovered and added to. She grinned and looked over at her friends. Princess, with all of us working together, everything is possible. Celestia smiled and nodded, her flowing mane shifting slightly with the movement. Well then, I shall leave you to your task. As much as I hate to say it, I believe that you all have a train to catch. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to spend much more time together, but Luna, Cadence, and I must get back to our duties as soon as possible. Cadence will escort you out. She leaned down and lightly hugged Twilight. It was good to see you, my dear student. May you and your friends have a safe trip home. She pulled back a bit and glanced at Grevin, who turned and made his way down the hallway to the large double doors leading to the grand hallway, before leaning back with a hint of laughter in her voice. And I wish you luck with your endeavors in romance. Twilight giggled and slightly as a blush came to her cheeks. Thank you. With that, she turned quickly and ran out of the door, following the group, knowing that she was about to meet with Cadence along with Applejack and Fluttershy to learn a way to cause Grevin to see them as more than just simple friends, and perhaps as a love interest.